So as you've heard, Mr. Bezan is the MP and he's currently Shadow Minister for the National Defence and represents the federal riding of Selkirk-Interlake and Eastman in Manitoba. As Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence from 2013 to 2015, he was active on files dealing with military procurement, mental health issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, an issue of grave concern, and the war against ISIS and the Russians' aggression in Ukraine. He was the Conservative Shadow Minister for National Defence and the Civil Chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence from 2015 to 2021. Mr. Bezan is going to outline critical rethinking roles in the jurisdiction of the military, natural disasters, and mitigation. So in other words, the future Canadian Armed Forces aid to the civil power. Please welcome MP James Bezan.
Thank you, and thanks, Alex, for bringing me back. He said I screwed up so bad last time. It's a chance for me to get things right. And Chad, thanks for being able to pull up the National Defence Act. I wanted to go through Part 6 a little bit. Don't want to plow the same ground that Ron just covered, but I think that, it's one thing to look at from an operator standpoint, and another thing to look at from a political standpoint. And us as parliamentarians, we've gone through this act a few times over the last few years, making updates mainly into the military justice system itself, and some of the overhauls, and make sure that victim bill of rights are been incorporated into military justice as well. But I think that we want to make sure that we understand that and I believe, how many in here have actually served? Good. I want to thank all of you for your service to Canada. I want to thank you for everything that you have done to keep us safe here at home. And of course, you have come here with a better understanding of the role of the armed forces and how at times tend to be divided, as Ron mentioned, as well, all too often spread too thin, too often, and it causes that burnout and the crises that we witness from time to time. But the paramount responsibility of the government of Canada is first and foremost to protect its citizens, and that includes protecting our shores. And I think most people, when they look at it, think of policing, the RCMP providing that public safety component. You think of the armed forces to keep the enemies at bay, often not thinking about Part 6 of the National Defence Act, which we see these ongoing operations, and they're standing operations that are carried out domestically. We have, right now, through the pandemic, we had Operation Laser, we had Operation Vector and vaccine distribution. We had always Operation Linus to deal with natural disasters, and Operation Limpid to deal with any potential domestic attacks. Ongoing operations, always standing on guard. And that, I think, is laudable. And I know that many of you have served on domestic operations. And we don't have to look too far from here. Fort McMurray, the fires. Go down to the Bow River Valley, Calgary, High River, and all the flooding that took place there. And why the forces come in? Because they have that chain of command. They have that ability to work as a unit and to attack the problem head on, whether it's a military problem or it's a natural disaster problem. I'm all too familiar with natural disasters in my riding at Selkirk-Interlake-Eastman. We have the North Red River, and we've had multiple floods along that river. Even though we are technically better protected because of the Red River floodway, but we do have ice jams and the problems that entails. We've had the mini tsunami that we call it in Lake Manitoba that caused over $2 billion worth of property damage and displaced several communities, thousands of residents for over a year. But there's also been what we consider some frivolous requests from the civil authority. How many of you guys had to go and help Mount Lansman shovel out Toronto? Those are the things that we really do have to start looking at, and should Canadian Armed Forces be that first line of defense. So when we look at, Section 275, Canadian forces are liable to be called out for service in aid of the civil power in any case in which a riot or disturbance of the peace beyond the powers of the civil authorities to suppress, prevent, or deal with and requiring that service. And when you look at that on the surface, we are talking about civil unrest. We're talking about rioting. We're talking about, major protests, potential resurrection of a coup, things like that. I think that's what most people think of. We look at the rioting and protests that are going on in the streets in Paris right now, right? I think that's what most people, when you read that, think it. And to drive that home, we go to section 277 in part 5 or part 6. When you look at it, we're talking about the Attorney General. Of course, most Attorney Generals now referred to as Ministers of Public Safety. But again, the Attorney General is the one in the province where that riot or disturbance has taken place, is considered to likely occur. So on the initiative of the Attorney General, or on receipt of the notification from, again, a judge of a superior county or district court having jurisdiction in the place that the services of the Canadian Forces are required to aid in controlling or helping the civil power. So why would we use justices to make that request? Because again, it comes down to the fact that you have potential of, a major riot going on. We have a situation where maybe they're trying to overthrow the government. And that's why you have those type of legal matters coming in. So again, you're looking at this potential that we are dealing with civil unrest, not natural disaster. And if you go down to 282, and Ron alluded to this, is that members, both officers and non-commissioned members, when they're called out on aid to civil power, are given in addition to their powers and duties as officers and non-commissioned members, all the powers and duties of constables, as long as they remain so called out at the discretion of the Chief of Defence Staff. Why would they need to be a constable when you're sandbagging or putting out a fire? It's because they're dealing, again, with a major criminal activity, civil unrest. And all we have to do is think back to really the last time that they were used in that head-to-head dealing with those disturbances, Oka crisis. Look how that turned out, 2 people killed. A rift between communities that still hasn't been resolved. A province that still hasn't come through with the arrangements and requests made, nor the federal government for that matter. The other major time that they were used, you look at the October crisis, 1970, Quebec, actual terrorist activity, domestic terror, but again, happening right here in Canada. That, again, didn't end well. And it's because of that use, the third time that the War Measures Act was used, that the Mulroney government brought in 1988 the new Emergency Measures Act to take away some of that, I guess, concept of military going head-to-head against its own citizens in our own country, and how badly that plays out in the public's eye. That's why, we did use the military to help with security at the G20 in 2010. We used them to help provide that extra strength and logistical as management of things on the ground at the Vancouver Olympics in 2010 as well. And they made a huge difference. But if you really look back, October, we used them when it was first called out in World War I, in the internment of Canadians, of Ukrainian, Austrian, and other Eastern Europeans, put in internment camps. My Baba and Guido were declared enemy aliens, weren't internment, enemy aliens, and had to report into the RCMP once a week. Problem was, their farm was 21 miles from the RCMP station. That's a day's travel one way with a horse and wagon. So 2 days a week, they couldn't do the work on the farm. The same thing happened with the Japanese in World War II. You know, and at the end of it, there has to be apologies given by the government. You know, these were, you know, I always say if you want to really look at how it was an abuse of legislative power by the government of the day. And this is where it becomes tricky, why we don't want to use this type of, as we just witnessed this past winter in 2022 in Ottawa. Is my Baba's, you know, she's my grandmother's declared an enemy alien, but her brother is fighting for Canada in places like Vimy Ridge, Hill 70. So, you know, to just stereotype individuals based upon ethnicity, which has happened when we use these types of powers, become problematic. So that's why I think that we need to look at why it wasn't used under, you know, why the military wasn't called in for the Freedom Convoys in Ottawa, why the military wasn't called in to take down the blockades at Coots, at Edmonton, Manitoba, at the Imperial Bridge at Windsor. They allowed policing to do it. And I think it comes down to that we've watched and witnessed an evolution of provincial and municipal policing as well as the RCMP being able to step up and make the necessary changes to the way they approach those types of potential disturbances. They now have, you know, very skillful SWAT teams, you know, urban warfare, paramilitary equipment, armored vehicles, combat outfits. They are able to walk in and get control of the situation. And maybe they should. Largely, it is municipal and provincial jurisdiction. Now, but when it comes to making those investments in our provincial natural disasters, our emergency measures organizations, some jurisdictions have been very, very slow. Newfoundland and Labrador doesn't even have an AMO anymore. They canceled it. They're completely dependent upon now, completely addicted to federal assistance, whether it comes through DFA or whether it comes through the Canadian Armed Forces. And so let's go down to Chad 285. Okay. And Ron alluded to that. Again, you have that this all should be paid out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund by the authority of the Governor and Council. So we have provincial jurisdictions that can have it all paid for when they use manpower, equipment, skill, and other resources coming from the Canadian Armed Forces, 100% covered by the Government of Canada. And on the flip side of that, when we witness, you know, major disasters like we saw in Fort McMurray, 90 cents on the dollar is covered by the federal government through the disaster financial assistance arrangements. So the actual cost long term to the province, to the municipality, has been mitigated already from a pure financial standpoint by the federal government. And yet, the one thing that frustrates me as a federal politician is the lack of initiative shown by some jurisdictions. And, you know, when you look at our charter, the Constitution of Canada, we'll right back to the British North America Act. Protection of property and individuals is provincial jurisdiction. And yet, as politicians sometimes try to do these things on the cheap. And that has caused undue, in my opinion, you know, stress and problems for our citizens. It puts an extra workload on members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And ultimately, you don't know how much longer we can sustain. You talk about deficits. Just look at our federal government deficits right now. You know, just if we froze spending today, and let the economy grow, it'd take another 30 years for us to balance the books. And yet we have to make significant investments, as we witnessed with healthcare, as we watch what's happening in the world around us, and as things get more dangerous. You know, NATO just came out with the numbers for this past year. We're all supposed to be at a minimum of 2% spending on national defense, which includes dealing with things like natural disaster. And we can even pay for veterans benefits, and that is accounted in as part of national defense spending. But Canada is down again to 1.22%. Based on today's dollars, we are short $21 billion what we're supposed to be spending. Question becomes, how do you spend it? When you got what I call, procurement constipation. We have bureaucratic red tape on largesse and malaise that is just making it impossible to procure equipment we need in a timely manner. Definitely at times of war, times of crisis, we can sole source, we can skip the queue and get over some of these Treasury Board rules that are in place. But it's more than just equipment. And, I'm always getting people writing in, and I just had a letter come from a couple in Winnipeg this week, and I was reading it, and they went, we should make sure that we make our Hercs dual purpose, our Chinook helicopters dual purpose, so that we can, go out there and use them as water bombers as well. Conceptually, good idea. We don't have the pilots to fly them. We don't have maintainers to work on the ground to keep those planes in the air. And we don't have enough aircraft as it is. If we are in to another major crisis, and I can tell you right now, our C-17s, our Herc aircraft, are stretched to the limit on missions they have to carry out right now. Helping with those supply lines to NATO members in what's happening right now in Ukraine. They are still being used to supply the NATO operation in Iraq and our troops that are sitting in Kuwait. So as long as we have these challenges and competition within Canadian Armed Forces for those scant resources, how do we go about getting them in the service for a natural disaster? Natural disasters do happen, but they're still, for the most part, unpredictable. Where when we got our guys and gals deployed and our equipment is with them, how do we manage bringing that resource back here to Canada? I think in this time of great power rivalries, potential for conflict and getting drawn into a situation that I think all of us are hoping never happens, but we have to be prepared to do. We have to be prepared to step up. And so just looking at Putin's aggression against Ukraine that we know could spill over into NATO, look at, the communist regime in Beijing, the interference they're doing here, and, the saber rattling that they're doing with their neighbors next door, and Taiwan specifically, but the Philippines and Japan, contesting different islands and who actually has control of them. That is the thing that we have to be prepared to deal with. And yet we don't have the resources to manage those operations, never mind also carrying out the domestic role here with Operation Lentis or Operation Laser. We have to make sure that we look at options. And so that's what, and you look at personnel, and we've all talked about this. Recruitment has been down. In October, General Wayne Eyre, Chief Defense Staff, said at the Defense Committee that the biggest existential threat Canada's facing right now is personnel. We're at the lowest levels, as Ron mentioned, in 50 years. We don't have enough people staying to replace those that they're having trouble getting to join. And so the numbers keep dropping. We finally saw some positive uptick in overall numbers in the last quarter. So hopefully we're getting over this morale crisis that has plagued the military for the last little bit, and that we're getting back to the concept of let's make sure that we have the men and women that can step up and do the job. And there's things that I'd like to touch on as I go down through this. And so I'm not here to present any specific policy, but over my tenure as both the chair and vice chair of the National Defense Committee, as also as Parliamentary Secretary of National Defense and the Shadow Minister for National Defense for the better part of the last decade, I put some thought and my staff and some colleagues talking about, what are the options out there? And how do we incentivize, Canadians to join up, whether they come in a civilian role or they come in through the armed forces role. And a lot of the time we're looking at, what Australia just went through. We look at what happened here because of pandemic. And we look here as well with some of these major disasters that we're starting to witness, and that seem to be increasing in frequency. So if you look at Australia, they have established a new agency called the National Emergency Management Agency, which is a combination. They had two federal agencies kind of doing the same thing, but not doing anything. And so they've had to, because of the major fires and drought that they went through over the last 3 years, combined the National Resiliency and Recovery Agency with the Emergency Management Australia Agency. And been able to put more resources into it. They use the military as, again, a means of last resort. They use the military for some of that logistical expertise, but they now rely on a number of civilian organizations to go out there and organize those that are needed to do everything from firefighting to recovery efforts to dealing with the follow with the families with the trauma that they've experienced. So they have both the Disaster Relief Australia as well as the Australian Civilian Court that step up and fulfill a lot of those things that government sometimes just isn't that good at doing. And I think that is something that we could take a look at. But as I said before, the one thing that Canadian Armed Forces brings to the board is not just manpower or logistical capabilities, but it is that command and control and being able to step in and assess the situation, take control of the situation, and utilize all the resources at their disposal in the best possible outcome, whether it's working with provincial agencies, working with other federal agencies, or working with civilians and municipalities. So we need to look at ways that we can have that surge capacity. And I've always been a big fan of the reserves. It's a good way to we can build up our overall troop strength and do it on a relatively affordable budget. As it stands today, the average member of the Canadian Armed Forces Reserve Force costs us around $43,400 per soldier, per sailor, per air crew. That is less than half of what it costs us to have someone in the regular force. So if we wanted to, double our forces up to 57,000 from where we are now, provide that surge capability, people that are, our citizen soldiers, and have them spread out effectively all over the country, a lot better than, we don't even have a base on mainland BC anymore. The bases are out in Vancouver Island. So if we wanted to have our armories full with reserve forces, why not look at increasing the number and have them there would have to definitely increase infrastructure to support them and increase the size of the armories. But what about looking at things like making sure that they're as part of that aid to civil power in your backyard, able to get at a scene a lot quicker. We've witnessed our armories are the ones that stepped up on the Lake Manitoba flooding. And that has made a big difference. A lot of them were locals, a lot of them had property out at the lake. And so they were out there in their units and under the command of the CDS. But when we go down this route, and so whether we take the reserves and we cross train them so that they are still deployable, they are still those that we had in Afghanistan, 22% of those that we deploy are reserves. And they prove to be excellent soldiers. And we want to make sure that we have that capability that in times of crisis, international conflict, that we can depend upon our reserves and deploy them out there. But they're also often at home, close to where the action's happening. If we look at what happened in Abbotsford and the big flooding there, and the lands or the rock slides around Chilliwack. So there is that part of it. Or do we make part of the reserves at a national level more integrated with Public Safety Canada, with public emergency preparedness, and that they would work more closely with other agencies? And then the other concept is that you actually set up a new part to the Canadian Armed Forces and a joint task force, essentially make it a domestic DART that could also be employed as disaster assistance and relief teams around the world. Why not have that capability here? But then you also have to make sure that if you're going to have that type of capability, that it is completely equipped as well. So I know that often some of our joint task forces are, specialize in managing the situation and essentially are the employer, but we grab resources from one unit, troops from another unit, logistical capabilities from someplace else. But I think at the end of the day, how we want to use the Canadian Armed Forces requires that bigger consultation and conversation between municipalities and provinces. We have to make sure that everybody is pulling their weight. At the end of the day, there's just one taxpayer. At the end of the day, it's our own properties and families that are at risk. And so we need to have that better emergency preparedness, planning. We have to balance off those competitive factors. Provinces need to understand that if we are into a major global conflict again, that they're going to have to do it alone because we may need all hands on deck. But I also see this as representing a great opportunity from the recruitment standpoint as well for the Canadian Armed Forces. Might be a great place for a lot of those that are phasing out of the forces, veterans, if they want to come back, if they want to even be employed as civilians, taking their training, their knowledge, their skill, and concentrating on natural disasters and domestic support to civilian power. I think it also provides us with that opportunity to attract in some that would never look at the Canadian Armed Forces again. Say we had more reserve units out there in people's communities, and they can say, you know what, this is close to home. I don't have to change my lifestyle that much. I get to still have my job that I'm doing. I get to still see my family all the time, or for most of the time, but I can be helping. And my primary role is going to be aid to civil power, dealing with natural disasters. Maybe we'd see enrollment numbers go up for everything from more women, more LGBTQ, more visual minorities, and make sure that what we have is force that reflects Canada today. So I think there's a great opportunity there, and you also look at what we're doing with Cyber Command. Does every person that does cyber have to meet the universality of service? And they're going to be sitting at a desk, running the computer, taking down those cyber threats as they're coming at us here in Canada. As I say, a lot of these people are coming out of mom and dad's basement, and they may not pass the fitness test. We'll let them go out in the gun range once a week and fire the real guns rather than what they have on their video games. But let's make sure we get the best of the best for the job that we have right now, so that we are the true north, strong and free. Thanks. Any questions? Your first minute.
Thank you. That's very more of a comment than a question. Thank you so much. I think there's so many challenges that we're faced as Canadians when it comes to disaster response and emergency management. And you talk about that responsibility being municipal and provincial. Yet in many municipalities, very small municipalities, the political powers really don't understand what their legislative authority and or requirements are. We place that responsibility on the local fire chief, usually. Within the country, most of the fire services volunteers. Now you're placing that responsibility on volunteer response to protect the communities now. So when they have a response requirement, they're asking the volunteer firefighters to come running from other jobs that they're doing to be able to provide that response. And or you're asking through mutual aid agreements for other municipalities to come help you, but again, they're relying on volunteers. So there really isn't any built capacity within any of that. And then you look at the legislation that governs it, and there really isn't any teeth for the municipal governments to actually have any level of field preparedness outside of those that maybe have experienced an event and have a little bit better understanding. It's just that it'll never happen here. So we have a lot of work to do as a province, but also as a country to really look at where we can create depth. But it's more of a comment. I appreciate you talking to me. Thank you.
I appreciate that. But my dad was municipal council. That's kind of how I got into the political book. And but we're not going to pin, right? We're out in the country. So I was driving into some of these farms out back along Ride Mountain National Park, and the guys would meet you at the door with a gun. What are you doing here? Oh, let's shoot you. So you know that's my introduction to politics. In Manitoba, we've had a lot of flooding, and I can say this, that in the last decade, we've been able to mitigate and be prepared to deal with it. The province now has, instead of bringing in the armed forces and sandbag, they've brought in almost like silage bags, but they're big, giant sandbags, machine filled, 500 feet at a time, 6 feet high. And they really hold back the water. One place you have to use small sandbags where you can't get machine between properties, but essentially you go out there, you build a drain bank, and that's how you protect communities. You do it along shorelines and rivers. The ice jamming that we used to experience on the North Red hasn't happened in the last decade, more than that now. It's because the three municipalities that were always impacted went out with the province with some provincial support and bought a bunch of icebreakers. And they go out there, they're called the amphibacks, they're actually a dredge, but they can also be used in icebreaking. They come out of Quebec. And they cut the ice, they bust the ice. They're out there right now doing it because they know the river's going to be unthawed, and the rush from down south is coming towards Lake Winnipeg, and it's going to all pile up in their municipalities. So since they started doing that, no more property tax, no problem. And the province helped with the purchase, and they set up a corporation, and they actually farm out that capability of other municipalities and communities, as well as small craft harbors to dredge out where, you know, the marinas and that we have along our beautiful lakes. And you know, we from firefighters, definitely municipality is always the first line of defense, and I appreciate the fact that it is volunteers. But that's where the province actually needs to step up as well and have that provincial fire teams. And most Alberta and the Prairie region have that. BC, like Manitoba, in my riding, they actually have half a dozen water bombers ready to go. Drop a hat. They just replaced them 5 years ago. Brand new water bombers. That makes a difference. They always have, I think, up to 1,500 firefighters available when we have those big fires happening up north. So that deployability, that there's costs associated with that, having those people on standby. But ultimately, how much force do they say? How much property do they say? How many communities are able to stay rather than being evacuated and set up in hotels and large urban centers, right? And the cost of, so it's a matter of balancing off those costs, and then the long-term impact of having to replace property that gets burnt down.
Yeah, those, they're saying those municipalities that have had experience, start thinking about there. There's many that have never had that experience.
That's why I say we need that bigger conversation of what federal government can do and what the provinces and municipalities can plan and prepare upon their own as well. Alex.
Yeah, Mr. Son. I found that the current way of dealing with natural disaster is very much of a band-aid treatment. It's an act part. It's never, we have enough technology out there right now that we can predict and project where and when disaster might happen. That's one. The other thing is, and we heard not so expert here today, that at the end there, we still have to pay for the military. The bill is being sent. And so, is there any way, perhaps, the federal government has the will or willingness to maybe perhaps erect some type of body, a permanent body, to deal with natural disasters only? They involve the province, the municipality, maybe even the territorial government. I know that the feds and the province, they don't talk to each other. Maybe that could change. And maybe we can get a better way, to undermine the resources of the military. Whenever we have to budget a portion of the military defense on natural disasters, you are taking away what the money should be spent on weapons and on resources. So, what's your feeling on that?
Well, I think on the federal provincial relationship, it has been until recently, especially on healthcare, it has been a disaster in itself. And even with the new funding that's coming forward, it's not a lot of use. I'm glad to be part of Pierre Poilievre Conservative Party, but Pierre is one of his planks in leadership race was that we are going to work with the provinces, not against them. And we need to have that conversation with them. So you got to have federal leadership for sure. Make sure that we are delivering emergency preparedness equally across the country. But at the same time, you got to have that provincial buy-in, because this isn't going to be cheap if we're going to do this right, and if we're going to be able to mitigate these factors. And so, forest fires is one thing. It's how we predict it. Definitely we know when there's drought and there's going to be challenges. And you look at California growing up, until this year. 4 bad years down there. Australia had 3 bad years. So we need to actually get better prepared how we protect communities first, and then the resource itself. Using, as you mentioned, technology, best practices from other jurisdictions, not just here in Canada, and employing that right across the country. Flooding is something that costs money to build and make sure that you can mitigate that long term and provide the infrastructure. And then River floodway cost $1.7 billion 15 years ago when it was expanded. And didn't even have to dig the first hole. The hole was already there. But it's the second biggest movement of water in the world, next to the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal, I should say. So you look at what investment needs to happen, what's the long-term benefit of that? And so we need governments that are prepared to make that initial investment. And that's, you know, and it follows the same concept. Why, you know, I always get a lot of people, why do you want to keep investing in our military? Why do you want new kit? Why can't we get by with what we got? This is about insurance. And the premium is what we invest in infrastructure, in flood mitigation, fire mitigation, and what we invest in our armed forces to deter those who want to destabilize our world and be there to provide to support the Canadians. Anyone else? Oh, in the back.
Yeah, on the note of enhancing the reserve capacity in Canada and utilizing them in natural disaster relief or any other role as called upon. What is the shadow cabinet doing to push the government towards these ends, dollar wise for recruiting? You know, you just mentioned we're 0.8% out of our GDP requirement. Additionally, incentives for them to join up and stay in, such as, I don't know what the current rate of pay is. It used to be 80% of regular for reserves and very little benefits. Possibly even follow Ontario's example of this week where they're legislating that reservists have to have their job guaranteed after deployment, make that a national thing and try and push for a viable, cohesive reserve community that will benefit national defense and the community as a whole.
Well, that's a great point. We just had released this past week a new pay allowance benefits going forward, as well as the housing differential. Treasury Board unilaterally changed the rules there. So a lot of our non-commissioned members are going to be severely penalized if they get above that $60,000 of income. They could lose a $7,000 housing differential benefit. We're doing the analysis right now on exactly how it's going to play out. I've already got members from right across the country have been writing into me, as well as Pierre and other members of Parliament. And we need to pay them for what they're doing for our country. I agree with that, whether it's Red Force or reserves. It's despicable when I hear of Canadians who have served in our reserves, and when they retire, it takes 24 plus months before they get their first pension check, because D&D can't figure out what their pay should be or their pension should be, because differentiating hours over the years and how many weeks were really served and how many were deployed, and some guys take a break and then come back, and those are challenges. I can get that administratively, but I've always believed that no person should be released from the Canadian Armed Forces, should be on pay until their pension checks are ready to be put in the mail or direct deposit into their accounts. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. As to the overall defense policy, Minister Anand is starting a complete review of hard stations, strong, secure, engaged. Next week, I'll be at her parliamentary briefing on where she thinks it needs to be updated. I can tell you that we need to make investments faster. The threat is evolving rapidly from an international perspective. We need to be prepared. We have, our Arctic sovereignty is at risk. Our capabilities up there are antiquated. Even our, RadarSat constellation, which was put up only in 2016, has passed its life as of 2025. We're only 2 years away from having to replace that, and there's no plans to replace our ability to monitor what's happening in our high Arctic using satellite technology. There's no plans on low Earth orbit satellites. There's no plans on getting drones to properly monitor things like icebergs and trying to use as much new technology as possible. Never mind having new ships, getting the F-35s here, as well as the infrastructure to support the F-35s in reasonable fashion. And looking at, upgrades to everything from Griffins and Chinooks to C-17s and replacing our older 130 Cs. So, we have more work that has to be done. And we still are dealing with a procurement process that just gets bogged down and it takes, we're talking decades when it comes to the F-35 to actually finally making the decision to buy. Including the one-time cancel on when we already announced we were going to buy it and cancel and step back in competition. And it was a roller coaster, but that's not the only thing that happened with it. Maritime helicopters was the same situation. And so we have a major overhaul to ensure that we can get the kit we need when we need it, support the defense industry that we have here in a way that we aren't giving up any sovereign control capabilities from a defense industry standpoint, in case we have to go onto a war footing, top to bottom, from the civilian side, the industrial side, as well as government military. And at the same time, respect the taxpayer. I take my fiduciary responsibility quite seriously. One of the reasons I ran in the first place was wasteful spending. So where's the priorities? Making sure that we invest in what's important and what's actually needed. Anything else? Well, I'll just say this. It's great to be back here in Edmonton. And, I just hope that if the Oilers and the Jets get in the playoffs together, go Jets, go.